Welcome to the Genre Hustle, your virtual sci-fi fantasy writers group. I'm Anton.
I'm Jane.
I'm Chris.
I'm Lucy.
I'm Chelsea.
I'm AP.
And I'm Carter.
And welcome to the first episode of Season 2. Welcome, everyone.
Woo!
Yay.
We've got Jane and Chelsea here today. Chelsea, can you give us a quick, background?
I've been with this the writers group from which Genre Hustle emerged. I think for 5 or 6 years. It's been a minute. And I write mostly fantasy with lesbians, though I also write sci-fi. And then when I write sci-fi, it also has lesbians. And my sci-fi tends to be fantasy and space. And I like mouthy protagonists with lesbians. So
Sensing a theme here.
I love a snarky main character.
Great. How about you, Jane?
I write fantasy and sci-fi mostly about characters who are fighting the man with magic. And usually a dash of romance as well.
We all need a dash of romance once in a
At
while.
least a little dash.
Well, today's topic is writing greats. We ended last season with writing gripes, so we thought...
Yeah, we were a little tired after a season of recording. But it's a new season. We're all excited. We're all happy.
We're turning that frown around.
Exactly.
We like writing again.
Yeah. We'll get back to you in a few weeks, though.
Season, yeah. So we thought we would start with writing greats. What is it that we love about when we're reading something? Why do we like it? What is it that does it for us? And since I opened my big mouth first, I'll start.
What?
No way.
Take it away, Anton.
So when we posed this topic, I had to go back to The Promise of Blood, the Scott McClellan book that came out a few years ago. And I had got this book from the library, and I got about 50 pages or 100 pages, and I realized this book had checked all the boxes for me. It had a magic system that had something to do with gunpowder or something, and then there was a bad guy who was a good guy and good guys who were bad guys and court politics. And I said, you know what? There you go. I bought all 3 books. I said, I'm in. They had me. And I said, and that to me is what I really look for when I'm reading these books is are they checking the boxes for me?
You like gray characters and political intrigue and
yeah, exactly.
Kind of like realism but fantasy kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And
What's the series again, Anton?
The Powder Mage Trilogy by Scott McClellan. The first book is called The Promise of Magic. Yeah.
And you mentioned something about humor and sarcasm also?
Oh, yeah. They're snarky, too. If the characters are... One's not just funny and the other one's serious and this one's, religious. Like, I like that they're all sarcastic, which, as I learned from my humanities professor many years ago, sarcasm is a form of violence. So they are violent in speech. They are violent in action. They have me, Scott McClellan's got me for 2,000 pages, however long the series is.
Yeah.
Like, he's got me. I'm in.
Yeah, I love books that do that. A big one that does that for me is The Emperor's Blades. That is by Brian Stavely. It's got these 3 siblings, and one is part of this elite fighting force, and so his group has he's got a caster, an archer, the bird pilot, the sword guy, the demolitions, and they all come together, and then it's just really cool watching them get deployed and they all know their role, and you get these really nice fighting scenes.
And the characters are distinct, so one voice from the other.
Yeah, the characters are distinct. In this elite fighting force, it's kind of a equal part men and women, and you can picture them really, really nicely. The other brother is out in the mountains. He's a monk and he's doing this really intense mental training, and then the sister's back at court, so you're kind of it was he checked all the boxes. There's a lot of geography, a lot of different settings, a lot of mythology, all baked into this really intriguing plot.
Right, and the writing is good too. It moves. Yeah.
So when we talk about characters, Jane, you'd mentioned not so much chemistry between the reader and the characters, but what were you talking about?
Yeah, so I love it I read a lot of romance as well, and I think my favorite genre is probably fantasy sci-fi that has a strong romantic subplot. And I love it when when the author does such a good job of showing you the chemistry on the page, usually from the moment that the characters meet. I think that's important. And so right? The whole time that they're going to get together, but it's all about how exactly, because often there are things that keep them apart. And so the whole mystery becomes, how are they going to overcome these barriers? And I do have an example, but it's a little
steamy.
sultry.
All right,
if we
so
wanna go
listeners
there.
under the age of 18, maybe just pause now.
It's not explicit because
Okay.
this is like their first. So this happens about a third of the way in this novella. It's The Magpie Lord by K.J. Charles, who is a wonderful speculative fiction writer. And the setup is that it's Victorian England, Victorian London, but with magic and wizards and shamans. And
That's a very
it's-
Jane book.
It's so on brand for me. It's so on brand. So we've got Crane is the Magpie Lord, the titular Magpie Lord, and he's like I don't know, 7th generation Earl or something, some fancy man from
Sounds hot.
Right. He is hot.
Totally into
Thank
him.
you. And then Stephen Day is the working class shaman.
Oh.
Who is he's just sort of like, he's almost like a magic cop. Like his job is to kind of make sure that the wizards don't get out of line. And so Stephen has just helped Lord Crane with this infestation. I won't go too far into it, but the supernatural infestation at his estate. And then so now they're taking a little break after.
This setup is
Taking the
great.
shirts off.
All right, so they're in the garden at night and they've just like dealt with some horrible supernatural stuff. And so they're kind of like, Crane reached out with his free hand and brushed his thumb slowly over Day's lips. He pushed them gently apart and felt them move with the pressure, opening, accepting the touch, breath fast against Crane's hand. Crane's need was suddenly violently urgent after the night's terror, and Stephen Day was kneeling before him, lips inviting, pupils dilated, a gift to be unwrapped. He pushed his thumb further into the warm mouth and felt a flicker of tongue against his skin, a tentative taste. So this happens. I won't go on,
Whoa,
but
whoa,
wow,
whoa,
this is
you
like-
can't just like
I'm gonna
stop
need a
reading
minute.
it.
right? Because you're wondering, like, not only does class separate them, because in Victorian London times that was
Sure,
a really
yeah.
big deal, but also like their situations and the fact that Stephen is supposed to be helping and protecting Crane, and Crane has all these personal issues too that are, kind of keeping him a little bit commitment phobic and so on.
And is it magic
So-
versus non-magic? Like one of them doesn't have magic?
Yes. Yeah. So Stephen has magic and Crane so far does not appear to.
Oh, okay. All right.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. but-
Anyway, so what I love about this is that it's such because she's built it up so much, that moment when you get to it is so incredibly charged. And even though it's kind of a little gesture, kind of touching the lip with the thought, it has so much meaning and significance because she's done such a great job.
Right, and then that
So-
sets up like the whole like romance for like the whole rest of the book.
Yeah.
Because all of their interactions after that are going to be kind of like charged.
Totally.
The other thing I really like about that scene is that is the body placement, because she's put Stephen, it was Stephen, right, who was on
Yeah.
his knees, because that's very evocative too. Like that could go a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, they're basically having sex without having sex
Yeah,
at this point, right?
Well, that's what I was
So-
going to say. I really like the subtlety of it and the pace as well. It's not like all of a sudden they just jump at each other. It's a tiny, tiny little gesture that is going to lead to a lot more, but it's paced well.
Yeah.
And I don't know if she I haven't read this, so I don't know if she does this, but I agree with you when it comes to romantic subplots. I really like when I know that two characters are going to get together and the author teases you and like he goes half of the book with them bickering or not. It's not happening. You're like, I know it's coming, but it hasn't yet.
Right.
So when is it going to get here? Like, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think it says a lot about who characters are as well, the way they express themselves sexually. If you're a violent character, then you would express yourself one way. If you were a nobleman, you would express yourself. I don't know. It seems so fitting that that's what he would choose to do, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that he sort of is kind of dominant in this scene, he can sort of take the first step, right? Which Stephen, I think, would not dare to do as being sort of a subordinate and
Yeah.
like below him in class as well. And then later, there's a chance for them to switch up the roles,
Yeah,
and that's
that's what I
also
want.
really fun.
Yeah, Princess Bride does that a lot, where they like the romance is there and then it goes away and then it's teased again and then it's back, and I love the Princess Bride. I honestly think the reason why I write fantasy is the Princess Bride, and I'm gonna tell you right now, It's that sword fight.
The
The one with
big-
Indigo and the Man in Black.
Yeah, that's pretty great.
Yeah.
'cause-
They're totally flirting in that whole.
Yeah, I was
sword
going to say
fight.
that's the romance right there.
They're definitely a little
they're
in love.
OTP. They're not OTP. It's just like, so that sparked like this whole interest for me. I fenced for 3 or 4 years in college, and I love sword fighting movies, and I love sword fighting. And so I guess my great is I love when you can tell that an author has either fencing training or sword fighting training or something, and and they've worked to put it into the book. So I've got 2 examples. One is Among Thieves. This is by Doug Hulick. This came out, I think, in 2011 or so. But I kind of want to talk about how, like, so he does it, but it's a little awkward, but you can still get a sense of the physicality. And then I've got my other example, that's the Traitor's Blade, and he kind of like characterizes it so it really pops. So let me show you. This is from Among Thieves. I backed away quickly, putting my left leg behind me, drawing my body into profile. My rapier went out before me while my dagger stayed close to my body. I couldn't threaten with the shorter blade this way, but I could, hopefully, have a bit more time to defend with it. So I like that a lot because you get a very vivid sense of like the physicality. So like, okay, right leg goes here, left leg is here, but that can get, I think, a little.
I mean, that was pretty clunky. I mean, especially if you're in the middle of a sword fight, are you really thinking all of those things?
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
like,
That's kind of where I was coming at it with. I'm not thinking like left leg go here, right leg go here, extend at head, blah blah blah.
like I could follow along. Like Jane was just now.
Yeah, Jane was
acting it
motioning
out.
for those of you
Yeah.
who can't
Act it
see.
out,
Yeah.
y'all.
So here is the Traitor's Blade. His name is Sebastien de Castell, and that's his name. Like, that's not a pen name. That is his real name. Like, his
Fabulous
his
name.
parents named him on purpose.
To be a writer.
Yeah.
Basically.
And so he's just described this technique called Ifodor, and it's called encapsulating the blades. And imagine 2 opponents, each of whom wants to outflank you. So they try to move apart from each other and circle toward you in an attempt to get on either side of you. You, on the other hand, clever fellow that you are, don't want to let them get on either side of you because it means you'll get killed. So you step backward and occasionally follow the same circle toward one of them so that the other is slightly out of reach of you, and now you're only fighting one man for a moment and you have the chance to eliminate one enemy. Your opponents, on the other hand, bright fellows that they are, don't want you to do this. So they keep adjusting their footing to keep you at equal distance from them, creating an arrowhead position with you at the point and them at the sides of the triangle. This sounds elegant, but in reality it mostly looks like 2 men jabbing repeatedly at one man who is trying his best to bat aside their blades with roughly the same amount of grace as a cow trying to step on a mouse.
That's great.
Yeah.
And it's got humor, which is good.
So like it's got humor. You hear the protagonist's voice really, really well, and he just describes it so carefully. He's not saying like right blade goes here, left blade goes there. It's I've got 2 men coming at me in a triangle, and all I have to do is pivot and keep them on their toes so they keep reacting to me.
And it lets the reader sort of imagine the scene themselves without having to block it out. At the
Yeah.
emotion.
Yeah.
And
It's important.
I like that. Like it is a little intrusive, just his like the way that his voice is, because it's a little instructive. But I kind of like it because he's not breaking up the fight scene. He's telling you, all right, here's how it went down. And then the next paragraph, he he cuts one's leg and then he gets the other one to surrender, and it's just really quick. But I just like it because it's voicey.
That's what I always like, is when like the action's kind of narrated in real time and there's not too much. Like I really like that passage because you kind of get the sense that he's really got a handle on everything that's happening. And then I think like I also like more intense action, I guess, where you kind of like are right there, like on the edge of your seat with the protagonist, like dodging and ducking and swinging and stuff like that. And like you don't really even quite get a sense to react because it's just like written in real time like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I try to do that with my own stuff. What I try to do is I remember how tiring a duel or a bout used to be in fencing. Think about my feet dragging on the floor. Think about like the sweat dripping down my face. Think about how my hand starts to get tired around the blade, and like just the slap of blade on blade. It does, it sends shock up your arm, and it does start to hurt after a while.
I didn't know you used to do fencing.
I didn't
That's
either.
awesome.
Same.
That's actually going to be one of my writing gripes for the end of the season, which is action scenes and like books where there's constant fighting and no one ever gets tired and just keep fighting for like 24
that's
hours
super,
in a row.
Because realistically, how long can you keep that going?
Like a minute.
Yeah, not very long.
No, Definitely not.
Chris is
Unless-
already
yeah.
prepping his gripes.
I'm already.
Yeah, boy, really.
I've already had it. Season one.
Well, do you like anything, Chris? Did you bring?
I
anything
do.
today?
Before we get to what you don't like.
I like you, Carter.
Oh,
Oh,
that's nice.
Well, so for me, one thing that's really important for me as a writer is a sense of place and stuff. So when I write a lot about Los Angeles, because I live in Los Angeles, I find that like one thing I love in writing is when there's a strong sense of place and a strong sense of culture, specifically one that is unfamiliar to me, takes me out of my day to day when somebody takes me into this world. One thing example that I have that I read recently is a book called Lagoon by Nnedi Okorafor. It takes place in Lagos in Nigeria, and it's basically a first contact story. These aliens come down and everyone starts interacting with them, et cetera, et cetera. But it's got such a strong sense of place. It's the type of story where the way she tells it, it couldn't have worked in any other city, in any other culture. Like she ties in all of this like traditional mythology and scenes of walking through the city, and it's all, for me, it was all new. And I've had this similar experience like reading Haruki Murakami for the first time when I reading about Tokyo or something like that, et cetera, et cetera. And I love that. I love being transported to a place by a writer who knows what the hell they're talking about.
And I feel like that's why I also love historical fiction too, or things that, because time is
Similar,
a place,
yeah.
right? And so when someone can evocatively bring Victorian London or, to life in this like incredibly vivid way, it's just magical.
Yeah, historical fiction is the same thing for me, absolutely. And this book in particular also has things like a semi-sentient highway that likes to kill people and collect their bones and stuff. You should just read it.
Isn't that the 405?
Yeah, it's like...
It's
Yes.
almost like the place that the book is set in becomes
A character.
There you go,
yeah.
in the story itself.
I absolutely love that sort of thing. It's something I try to do. I don't think that it has to be even... For me, it doesn't necessarily have to be something exotic or strange or far-flung. It could be just like... somebody sets us something in Boston or something like that. But to me, that's something I love when I read.
I went to this great workshop actually on setting, and the guy had a really good note. He said, your setting is essentially your palette, the thing that you draw from. And he said, one of the best things to do is just to walk out into the street of your neighborhood, take a big piece of paper and write down everything that you see. And then depending on whose point of view the character is talking from, they would pick what that they would notice on the street. Would they notice buildings going, sort
Right.
of construction going on, or would they notice the ice cream shop because they're
Or the
kids?
pantsless man
Or the
Man in the
who
rain.
you saw
man.
earlier. The naked man.
what would they notice, or what would they think about, and then use that and try and draw from it for every chapter, and that will bring your story to life.
Yeah, I think that can even be useful when you're writing like epic fantasy or something that's set in a totally imagined world. Like I'm writing this book about pirates right now, which like I've never been a pirate and never like
What?
No,
yeah,
come
and
on.
I've
You're a total.
but you have a
pirate.
ponytail.
yeah, that's true.
And you have a squid on your arm.
I'm doing the best that I can. Okay?
You're a
as
modern
much of
pirate.
You're as much of a pirate as you can be at this time.
That's so nice
We
to
appreciate
hear.
that.
But like a lot of the setting of that book is informed by, I spent a few summers in college doing ecosystem research and bioassays and stuff in the Dominican Republic and a couple places in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
So like I spent a lot of time just taking notes on like what it felt like to be in that kind of environment and what things looked like and what like old buildings in the towns that I was in looked like and stuff like that. And so even though I'm not really writing in a real world place, still trying to use like a real experience in a real setting to inform it, I think is super helpful, and also something I really like when I'm reading, something that feels real and, you know, like so real you can almost like smell it and taste it, even though like you've never actually been there.
Right.
I got that from the Marlon James, the story of 7 killings. Am I saying, is that the right one?
History of Seven
The History of 7
Killings,
Killings.
yeah.
That one I really got Jamaica because of the language. Like that's what really sold it for me on that book.
And you can feel like you're there almost
Oh,
sometimes.
it's
I remember
amazing, yeah.
from that book. You know, that actually ties in with what I want to talk about is zeitgeist and atmosphere in writing. And one of my favorite things that an author does is exactly that. They have such a command over language that they use it very, very intentionally to create a zeitgeist, a kind of mood to the entire book that's also linked to the character's POV. So the example that I just fell in love with recently was Circe by Madeline Miller.
I love that book so much.
Yeah. It's amazing, and the entire story is told through the perspective of Circe, the witch of Aiaia, and she talks about the Greek myths that unfold around her. And all of her, because she's a witch, all of her metaphors, all of the analogies that she uses are very nature-based. So she often uses animals or weather in order to describe things to the reader. So when she's describing her mother, she says she is with a mind like a spike-toothed eel.
Ooh.
And
that's very evocative.
That's neat.
It's wonderful. And she talks about her father. She said, when my father returned at night, the ground rippled like the flank of a horse. So we get a picture, but we also know that her world is very, very steeped in nature. She says, like water from a cataract, like a waterfall. And when she's describing her sisters, she says, they love to sneer at me from behind their ermine paws. So all of her language is just...
This book sounds awesome.
It's
It
so
is
good.
absolutely amazing. So it has this real zeitgeist feel to it that is very witchy and nature kind of based.
It's funny.
wonderful.
We were talking before the podcast off mic. We were talking about Naomi Novik's Spinning Silver, which I'm listening to right now, and she does the same thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of everything is very cold in this book. There's a lot of like ice-based metaphors and stuff, and it's all very like evocative, and it adds to the atmosphere of the book, and everything ties in so tightly. It's similar to Circe.
Right. It's like poetry. It's really, honestly.
And also the other thing she does is something that you, Lucy, were talking about earlier, and that we were talking about in regards to like POV and world building through POV, because this was the other thing that I wanted to bring in as my writing. Great, but
Well done, Jane.
talked about it.
Very
Go
organic.
on, you can have another one.
Chris brought it up, but she does this so she has multiple POVs in her book, which I personally find very challenging to write and sometimes to read too. But
I agree.
she not only distinguishes them really expertly so that you immediately know within the first line who it is, but she uses that to show you different aspects of the same world. So you've got you've got the young Jewish moneylender daughter, and then you've got the poor Gentile, girl from an abused family. And then later on, you get basically like a nobleman's daughter. And it's just, and you learn so much about this fantasy world through exactly what Lucy was talking about, what they notice, what they tell you, how they think about the world around them. And it's
So
just
you've seen
genius.
the same event or the same moment just through...
Or the same world, at least.
But describe, or they're noticing different things about the event.
It's not, you're not seeing the same event necessarily through different eyes, but you're seeing interlocking events. They all kind of bounce off each other later on in the book as you go through. Like they sort of keep coming closer and closer together, which is a whole nother trick of awesomeness.
That is a real skill.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so what I was going to talk about is kind of similar to that. One thing that I think is extremely great is when an author pulls off the whole story within a story thing and is able to do it in a way so that both the story and the story that the story is about kind of influence each other. The biggest example for that for me is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski, which was my favorite book for a long time and honestly might still be my favorite book. And what he does is, without giving too much away, the book is really about this guy, Johnny Truant, who discovers this file in his neighbor's house that has all of these videos and documents about this haunted house story. So about half the book is the actual haunted house story, and the other half is basically all told through footnotes and editor's notes, and it's about Johnny and what happens to him as he's exploring this weird horror story. Parts of it start to affect his life, and it he grows and changes and deteriorates in different ways along with the plot of the story that he's supposedly compiling. And it goes together so well. It's honestly one of the coolest things I've ever read. And it kind of reminds me in some way of the whole Kurt Vonnegut metafiction thing where like the author's a character in the story, and like you kind of get the story of him writing the book as you're reading the book. And I mean, to me, like the House of Leaves thing is an even cooler version of that, because you get the protagonist is really the one exploring the story, and then that story has its own protagonist, and you learn how they relate to each other.
And why do you think that? Because I'm also reading a book that does something similar at the moment, and why do you think that is the choice? Is it about how stories shape characters, or is it about
I think
how powerful stories are?
I mean, I don't know. I'm Chris is the one with the MFA and literature.
Oh, God, thanks a lot.
I mean,
Why,
I think
Chris?
it's kind of the whole like postmodern thing of like the act of telling a story, and
Yeah,
like
it's metafiction.
Yeah, metafiction.
It's also not easy to do.
Right. It's super hard to pull off. I've attempted it in like short stories and stuff.
I was
and
going to
it's
say, I
always
did it in the
garbage.
last Varja story, and everyone gave me notes. They're like, you got to cut this story down. Nobody cares about the story within a story.
But what does
No,
that
I
mean?
liked it.
Metafiction.
It
Can you define
means,
that? Further?
well, I can't define it well, but it's essentially writing
Can you define it
about
poorly?
the act of writing, or using like the act of the creating the art as part of the art, sort of.
Gotcha.
Like Slaughterhouse
was
5,
good.
for example.
Yeah, that was
like
good.
you kind of get like Kurt Vonnegut's input of like how he feels about the story. He constantly reminds you that it's a fictional story that he's writing
Right.
as you're reading it. House of Leaves is a little different because it's more of an actual like story within a story thing, but that's kind of the same idea, is that the act of writing the story is part of the story, and they're not separate.
Wow.
Right. And,
That's amazing.
I always see it as a structural device, too. where-
Right, absolutely.
But when it's done really well, they become these sort of stories that begin to merge at some point, right?
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
They're heading towards the same kind of conclusion, which that's when it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I know that's what Name of the Wind was.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but yeah.
Yeah, I've been
Yeah, that's a
thinking
point
about
for you,
it.
too.
Yeah, like I think he's gonna get there to where these two stories kind of merge eventually. I don't know when that's gonna
I'll take
happen.
that bet.
Yeah. Like,
Though, to be clear, we're not calling Name of the Wind metafiction, right?
no.
No, but
no,
it's a
no.
story within a story.
story
Like
within
he's
a-
telling
Yeah,
a
yeah,
story,
yeah.
so it's
And-
It's a framed story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that goes more to the framework, yeah.
And I think the story that's being told, so like the second level, like the kid backstory, I think it's actually like you can kind of tell that it's actively being kind of edited and played with a little bit by the speaker. 'Cause-
Right.
And it allows the writer to do some sort of tricky things, which some people might call gimmicks, but I personally think it's really interesting and fun. Like Italo Calvino, the classic one is like Calvino's "If on a Winter's Night a Traveler," right? And so, sort of acknowledging that there is the act of creating a story allows the writer to kind of step outside the story creation entirely and make comments, right, addressed directly to the reader or what have you about
Yeah.
the process itself, which I think can be a really powerful tool. Although sometimes it can get a little too precious. Is that, you know
Yeah,
what I
well-
mean? Like
well
it's a
said,
little
Well, we
too...
do talk
Yeah.
about that in the
Yeah.
POV episode.
It's sort of like the omniscient narrator kind
No,
of idea.
that's the second person when.
Okay.
when the author's telling the reader what you are doing,
Right.
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Okay, like the Shakespearean breaking the fourth wall
Yeah.
to talk
Yeah.
to the audience.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that in depth and
We have plenty of that.
Yeah.
in our
Get so excited.
multi-hour
Yeah,
POV
two-parter.
episode
That's our big
extravaganza.
Christmas special.
Yeah, exactly.
But to Jane's point, I did struggle with that a little bit reading Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie.
Oh, good example.
I mostly loved that book, but I did feel like the meta fiction was like a little much for me sometimes. It almost made like the way he weaves it together, like the story of him writing it and how that like relates to like the formation of India as an independent country and stuff is awesome. But it made the book a little hard to get into because I wasn't sure what the actual story was. So I think it's, I mean, not that I would be telling Salman Rushdie how to write or anything.
No, it's
You can do whatever you want. It's your podcast,
guy.
guy.
Yeah, I do think, like,
I don't even think Salman Rushdie has a podcast.
I don't think so either.
We should get him on this one.
Yeah, we could have him on. See what we can come defend yourself, Salman.
Yeah.
Like he hasn't done enough of that already.
Like he's really-
But yeah, I do think that like, if you're too meta, if you're doing like, a really, kind of detached narration kind of thing, it can be a little difficult for some readers to get into.
I think you run the risk of coming off as pretentious and
Yeah.
coming off as a little high-minded. It's kind of like I don't know. It's like the analogy in music would be like, fusion in the 70s. Maybe,
No, I was just going to say, I think I may be one of those readers that it's too high-minded for, because I tried to read Midnight's Children recently, and I was like, I have no idea what's happening. I don't know what the story
It's interesting because it's something that I don't think you see as much in fantasy and science fiction as you do in literary fiction. It's definitely a thing that you see more often that way. I'm dying to read House of Leaves. I feel like that's a major
it's so good
mark on my record.
Shit ever.
So.
I think so. Jen Lyons has that new book out that I recommended to my grim dark bros because it is a pretty grim dark, and she
totally
does
banned.
a really interesting and rather intricate. Like, I haven't finished the book or anything. I just started it, but it is a story within a story with commentary about what's happened. So so it's like the characters are sort of telling the story, but also sort of commenting on each other's stories, and and it's interesting. I don't know where it's going yet, but I
mean, it can be really cool as a framing device because it does allow you to do some different POV stuff than just doing straight close third or whatever.
But see, like you said, it's a framing device. So, I mean, sometimes I want to get sunk into the story so much that I forget I'm reading a story.
And that's my thing, is it does, a lot of times when I'm reading fantasy, I want escapism. I want to be immersed in my imagination or the author's imagination, and being reminded that there's a person in real life writing the story can kind of break that a little bit.
Right, and that gets to what I wanted to talk about is when you're so grabbed by the author and the plot that you kind of forget that it is a story. And then you get to a point where there's a twist or a turn and you totally didn't see it coming, and they totally smack you in the face with it, and it's super effective. So the example I have is from Leigh Bardugo's Crooked Kingdom. And I kind of enjoyed these books. They weren't really for me, but I think she did a great job with the twists. And this is a little spoilery, so I apologize. But at the end of the second book, Crooked Kingdom, so chapter 31, in the end, he was not Nina or Matthias or Kaz or Nnedi or Jesper. He was just Wyland Van Eck. He told them everything. So at this point, something goes terribly wrong with their plan, and you're right there in there. You're like, oh man, he was supposed to stay out of it. It all went wrong. And then at the end, you see it was meant to go wrong. And that twist is just it just punched me in the face.
Yeah, no, she's really good at that. Like Six of Crows, it felt like almost every chapter there was at least a little twist or turn or a little new revelation that kind of forced you to reconsider the events of the previous chapter. Yeah. It's really well done.
I liked that too.
The one I like, Chelsea, is the beginning of the second V.E. Schwab. It's not Conjuring of Light. What's the Coming of Shadows? I can't remember the second book.
I haven't read the second one yet. So.
Oh, okay. Well, the beginning is fantastic, and it brings you right back into the story in such a neat way. But okay, I thought you'd read them all three. No,
I read the first one. I think I read the first chapter of the second one. So I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
What's the first one called?
Oh, of course.
A Darker Shade of Magic.
Darker Shade of Magic. Yeah.
And it's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
I was gonna say about the story within a story structure. Sorry to bring it back to that, but. It was noted that we don't see that as much in fantasy and sci-fi, and I think the reason is because as genre writers, we tend to have our hands full with, world building. So I've already got the job of setting up the second world and getting everybody into it, and fantasy at least. Though I don't know if this is as applicable for sci-fi, but it definitely is for fantasy. Is the intention? The intention is to be escapist.
A lot of the time, yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time it's meant to be escapist, and so to have intrusive devices like that can actually, depending on what the author wants, can work against their goals.
It's not unlike the device of having an older narrator telling a story of when they were younger. And I get the same feeling from that. I think, doesn't Scott Lynch do that in The Lies of Locke Lamora?
Yeah,
I think
Scott does.
Yeah.
And everyone loves this book. And I have the same problem with it. I find the fact that we are... And I do understand what the device is for, because you get a certain perspective from an older narrator that you wouldn't necessarily if you were just immersed in the story. But part of me was like, why can't we just tell the story? Because the story is wonderful.
Yeah. And I think what happens is that, at least with Scott Lynch... it takes away a little bit of the the tension of those younger scenes, because since it's older Locke like recounting it, and all these characters are still there, you know that they all live, at least. You know that, nobody goes away. Like, they survive through childhood.
Right.
Yeah, it becomes
which, in that book is a little dicey.
Yeah, it becomes more of a how done it than a who done it kind of deal, where like it's sort of the end result, but it's the journey is of how they get there.
I really like that, and I love it when the frame itself is also immersive. Like this isn't spec fic, but it's historical fiction, sort of. But Possession by A.S. Bryant. Right, which is sort of two parallel stories, one set in the past and one set in the present. And the present people they're scholars and they're researching the past event and sort of telling you about it, but also you dip into the past itself. And it's really marvelous because it's like you're able to sort of maintain this immersion in, both tracks, as it were. I thought it was really well done. So sometimes I think that framing device can actually like deepen the story.
I agree. Bernard Cornwell does the same thing with The Winter King, his King Arthur stories, where it's being told by the last survivor of King Arthur's court.
Ooh, I want to read that.
And, he's old now and the queen is coming to visit him and she's like, oh, tell me more stories of this. And he's like, look, I'm not supposed to talk about this anymore. Like I gave that all up. She's like, no, tell me. So he's like, okay, well, there was this one time, and then it goes into the story. And as the books go on, you realize like he lived, but it's like, geez, at what cost? And so it's exactly that, Jane, where there's the story that he's telling is the real story, but then there's also his story, and where does that actually end? And I found it to be really interesting.
So I'm glad we got a chance to talk about what we liked in what we're reading, because we came off a little grumpy, I think. We'll get there again eventually, but
we're lovably grumpy.
I would say it was normal grumpy. Yeah.
So we covered a couple other topics that we're going to discuss this season in what we just talked about. So we're going to have a little bit of POV, some action. We're going to have a little bit of gato meowing on mic. But, we want to hear from you guys too. Tell us what you think is what you look for when you're reading, or just something that you read recently that really drew you in. We want to hear your examples because, there's just the 7 of us here and there's a wide world of reading out there. So tweet us at Genre Hustle. We'd love to hear you.
All right, that was the first episode, season 2. Stick with us. We're going to have a lot of fun. We'll see y'all next time.
Woo!
Bye.
Bye.
All right, bye.